The Dark Side Diaries. Harold Frederick Shipman, the doctor who killed over 250 people. Imagine putting your life in the hands of someone you trust, a doctor sworn to protect you. But what if that doctor saw you not as a patient but as prey? Harold Shipman wasn't just any doctor. He was a man who played God, choosing who lived and who died. With a syringe in his hand and a reassuring smile, he took the lives of at least 250 people, most of whom never even saw it coming. But how did he begin? And why did no one stop him sooner? Tonight we unravel the horrifying tale of Dr. Death, how he started, how he evaded justice for decades, and how his arrogance became his downfall. Before he became Britain's most prolific serial killer, Harold Shipman was just a boy from a working-class family, growing up in post-war England. His childhood seemed normal, but something inside him was different, something dark. This is the story of how a bright young man with a promising future became Dr. Death. Harold Frederick Shipman was born on January 14th, 1946 in Nottingham, England. He was the middle child in a strict working-class family. From an early age, his mother, Vera Shipman, made sure he knew he was special. She favored Harold over his siblings, encouraging his intelligence and independence. But she was also controlling. Her word was law in the Shipman household. Harold was naturally bright, excelling in school, but he wasn't popular. He kept to himself, rarely socializing, and seemed to look down on other children. Some classmates described him as arrogant, as if he believed he was better than everyone else. But then, something happened that would shape his entire life. In 1963, when Harold was just 17, his mother was diagnosed with terminal lung cancer. He watched as she wasted away, her once dominant presence reduced to frailty. But there was one thing that fascinated him: how her doctor treated her pain. Every day, a physician would visit and administer morphine, a powerful opioid. For a short while, Vera seemed better, relaxed, at peace. And then, as the drug wore off, the pain returned. Harold took it all in. He saw how morphine gave his mother comfort, and how it eventually took her life. Some say this was the moment Harold Shipman's obsession with morphine and power over life and death was born. After his mother's death, Shipman became determined to pursue medicine. He enrolled at the Leeds School of Medicine in 1965. Despite his intelligence, he struggled socially. He was known for being distant, arrogant, and unwilling to take criticism, but academically he excelled. During his medical studies, he showed a particular interest in pharmacology, especially opioids like morphine. Professors noted his keen understanding of pain management. In 1970, at just 24 years old, Harold Shipman graduated as a doctor. He quickly secured a position at Pontefract General Infirmary, where he began working as a junior doctor. But just a few years into his career, the first cracks began to show. In 1974, Shipman was hired as a general practitioner at the Abraham Ormerod Medical Center in Todmorden, West Yorkshire. To his colleagues and patients, he was an ambitious young doctor with a bright future. But behind closed doors, he had a secret. Shipman had developed an addiction to pethidine, a synthetic opioid similar to morphine. He wasn't just prescribing it, he was taking it himself. And then, the fraud began. To fuel his addiction, he started forging prescriptions for large quantities of pethidine. but he wasn't as careful as he thought. In 1975, a local pharmacist noticed irregularities in his prescriptions. The truth unraveled fast. Shipman was caught, fined £600, and forced into rehab. Most doctors would have lost their careers. But incredibly, after completing a brief stint in rehabilitation, he was allowed to return to medicine. By 1977, he had moved to Hyde, Greater Manchester, where he started fresh at the Donnybrook Medical Center. No one there knew about his past, and no one suspected that he had already taken a life. The First Killings, a Doctor's Deadly Secret. Shipman's first documented victim was 70-year-old Eva Lyons. It was March 1975. Eva had been feeling fine that day, a little tired perhaps, but nothing unusual. Then Dr. Shipman arrived for a routine home visit. He spoke gently, smiled, reassured her, then pulled out his syringe. Minutes later, she was dead, a lethal dose of morphine in her veins. Her family grieved, but no one questioned the doctor's report. After all, she was elderly. It was natural, right? Shipman had found the perfect method. He could kill without anyone suspecting a thing, and he wasn't going to stop. From the late 1970s to the 1990s, Shipman's murders became routine. He perfected his technique, choosing his victims carefully. Elderly women who lived alone, whose deaths wouldn't raise suspicions. And his method was always the same. He'd arrive for a home visit or invite them to his office. He'd administer a lethal dose of diamorphine, medical heroin. He'd leave, often before they were even dead. He'd sign the death certificate claiming natural causes. Each death was written off as old age. No investigation, no autopsy. But some cases stood out. Maureen Ward was only 57 when she met Harold Shipman. Unlike most of his victims, she wasn't frail or elderly. She was still active, still sharp. But she had been feeling under the weather and booked an appointment with her trusted doctor. Shipman examined her, wrote her a prescription, and then offered to give her an injection to help her feel better. But as soon as the needle went in, Maureen felt something was wrong. Her vision blurred, her limbs went weak. She tried to speak, but her tongue felt heavy. She collapsed in his office. This should have been the moment he was caught. But Shipman, ever the actor, called emergency services and claimed she had suffered an unexpected heart attack. She was dead before they arrived. Emily Jackson was 73, a retired teacher who still had a sharp wit and a love for life. She had been seeing Dr. Shipman for mild arthritis. He'd always been so kind to her, so when he suggested a home visit for a routine injection, she agreed without hesitation. Her grandson had been visiting that day and remembered watching her chat with Shipman just minutes before he left. She was laughing when he walked out the door, he later recalled. Then 5 minutes later, she wasn't breathing. Cause of death? Natural causes. Her family found it strange, but again, no one dared question a doctor. By the late 90s, Shipman had grown more careless. Bessie Halsall, 79, had lived on the same street for years. She was known for sitting by her window waving at the neighbors as they passed. One day, a neighbor saw Dr. Shipman enter Bessie's home for a supposed checkup. He left just 15 minutes later. An hour after that, an ambulance arrived. Bessie was dead, cause heart failure, according to Shipman. But the neighbor never forgot. And when the truth about Shipman came out, they realized they had watched a murder in real time. For over 2 decades, Harold Shipman killed in plain sight. As a trusted doctor, he injected his victims with lethal doses of morphine, signed their death certificates, and walked away, completely unnoticed. But in the late 1990s, people started asking questions. At first, only a few people noticed the pattern. Local undertakers in Hyde were among the first to grow suspicious. They noticed that many of Dr. Shipman's patients died sitting up in their chairs, fully clothed, often just hours after seeing him. It wasn't natural. Most elderly patients die in bed. Then funeral directors realized something else. Shipman's patients weren't just dying often. They were dying alone. No family members were present, no witnesses, and just Shipman and his syringe. Still, no one dared question a respected doctor. But then came the death certificates. Shipman signed an unusually high number of them, often listing vague causes like old age or stroke. He also encouraged cremation, a convenient way to destroy any evidence. Some doctors in Hyde even joked that if you went to see Dr. Shipman, you might not come back. But it wasn't a joke. By 1998, suspicions had grown, but Shipman remained untouchable. That changed when Kathleen Grundy, a healthy 81-year-old former mayor, died suddenly. Her daughter, Angela Woodruff, was a lawyer. When she discovered that her mother's will had been changed, leaving everything to Shipman, she immediately suspected foul play. The handwriting was crude, not her mother's. At first, detectives weren't convinced. Shipman was a well-respected doctor. Was it possible that this was all just a misunderstanding? But Angela was persistent. She knew the will was a fraud, and she was convinced Shipman had something to do with it. To verify her suspicions, detectives ordered an exhumation of Kathleen Grundy's body. When toxicology results came back, the evidence was undeniable. A massive dose of morphine had been found in her system, the same drug Shipman had administered to dozens of patients before. It was murder. The forged will was no longer just a legal dispute. It was the first solid proof that Shipman had killed one of his patients. Now police had a crucial question. Was this an isolated case? Or was there something far worse at play? They began investigating Shipman's patient records, looking for anything unusual. What they found was horrifying. Detectives pulled Shipman's medical records and compared them to recent deaths under his care. What they found was a chilling pattern. Many of his patients had died suddenly, often just hours after seeing him. Most deaths occurred at home, without witnesses. Shipman had signed an unusually high number of death certificates, always listing natural causes. He frequently encouraged cremation, ensuring that bodies would never be examined. The more they looked, the more cases they found. Police began exhuming more bodies, testing for morphine. Again and again, toxicology reports revealed the same deadly truth. Shipman had been injecting his patients with fatal doses of opioids and then covering his tracks with false medical records. It was now clear Kathleen Grundy wasn't his only victim. She was just the last. At exactly 8 a.m., police arrived at Harold Shipman's home in Hyde. The sun had barely risen. Residents watched from their windows as detectives surrounded the house, waiting for the moment that their town's most trusted doctor would be exposed as a monster. Shipman was inside, completely unaware that his double life was about to end. Then, a loud knock at the door. When Shipman answered, Detective Chief Inspector Mike Williams looked him straight in the eye and said, "Dr. Shipman, you are under arrest on suspicion of murder." For the first time in his life, Harold Shipman wasn't in control. Police immediately escorted him to the station, while teams began searching his home and medical practice for evidence. What they found sealed his fate. Inside Shipman's home, detectives uncovered crucial evidence: a typewriter, the exact one used to forge Kathleen Grundy's will; large quantities of morphine, the very drug used to kill his victims; medical records full of suspicious alterations, showing that Shipman had been manipulating patient histories to cover his tracks. It was all there, the tools of a killer, hidden in plain sight. And while police searched his house, Harold Shipman sat calmly in an interrogation room, waiting for what came next. Most killers, when caught, show signs of panic or remorse, but not Shipman. As detectives entered the room, they were met with a cold, emotionless stare. He didn't fidget. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He sat back, arms folded, as if he was the one in control. Detective Chief Inspector Williams began with a simple question. "Do you know why you're here?" Shipman smirked. "No idea." But detectives weren't playing games. They laid out the evidence: the forged will, the morphine overdoses, the patient deaths, all linked directly to him. Still, Shipman remained eerily calm. At one point, when asked about the altered medical records, he laughed, leaned forward, and said, "Do you really think you're going to pin this on me?" It was pure arrogance, as if he still believed he was untouchable. But the evidence was overwhelming, and Shipman knew it. As the interrogation went on, detectives noticed something. Shipman wasn't as confident as he wanted to appear. He avoided direct answers. He twisted facts. Whenever confronted with hard evidence, he either downplayed it or changed the subject. But the police kept pressing. They brought up case after case, patients who had died unexpectedly, all under Shipman's care. They revealed that toxicology reports had confirmed lethal doses of morphine in multiple bodies. Shipman had no explanation. For the first time, the smug doctor began to show cracks in his composure. He crossed his arms tighter. He shifted in his chair. He stopped making eye contact. Then came the final blow. Detectives informed him that more bodies were being exhumed and toxicology tests were already underway. Shipman stopped speaking altogether. He knew it was over. After hours of questioning, Shipman refused to say another word. When asked if he wanted to confess, he simply leaned back and said, "I have nothing to say." No remorse, no emotion, just silence. He had killed hundreds, and yet as he sat in that cold interrogation room, he acted as if it was all beneath him, as if he was still smarter than everyone else. But the evidence was undeniable. The next morning, formal murder charges were filed against him. Harold Shipman, the doctor who had once been trusted by an entire community, was about to face justice. Harold Shipman's arrogance was his downfall. For years he believed he was above suspicion, that no one would ever question a respected doctor. But all it took was one mistake, a forged will, and the truth came crashing down. Even in the interrogation room, he refused to admit what he had done. But in the end, the evidence spoke for him, and the town of Hyde would never forget the doctor who played God and lost. At first, he was charged with one murder, that of Kathleen Grundy, the woman whose forged will had exposed his crimes. But the investigation wasn't over. As toxicology results came back from other exhumed bodies, police discovered that at least 15 more patients had been injected with lethal doses of morphine or diamorphine, heroin. With each new result, Shipman's kill count grew. By October 1999, he faced 15 charges of murder and 1 count of forgery. The man who had once walked free as a trusted doctor was now locked in a cell, awaiting trial. On October 5, 1999, One of the most shocking trials in British history began. The courtroom was packed. Families of the victims sat in the gallery, waiting for answers. But Shipman remained stone-faced. He showed no emotion, no signs of regret. The prosecution laid out the evidence, forged medical records, showing Shipman had altered patient histories after their deaths, toxicology reports, proving that lethal amounts of morphine were found in the victims, testimonies from nurses and undertakers who had long suspected that Shipman's patients were dying too frequently. One by one, the families listened to the horrific details of how their loved ones had died, coldly, without mercy, at the hands of the very doctor they trusted, and yet Shipman sat calmly, as if none of it concerned him. Then came the defining moment of the trial. Shipman's defense team struggled to explain the overwhelming evidence. Why had so many of his patients died unexpectedly? Why did Shipman insist on cremation for so many of them? And why did so many victims have deadly amounts of morphine in their systems? Morphine only Shipman had access to. Shipman had no answers. When he finally took the stand, his arrogance shone through. He mocked the prosecution. He dismissed the family's grief as hysteria. He even claimed that the police had fabricated evidence to frame him. But the jury saw through it. After 6 days of deliberation on January 31st, 2000, the verdict was reached. Guilty on all 15 counts of murder. Guilty of forging Kathleen Grundy's will. Harold Shipman, the most prolific serial killer in modern British history, was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But even then, he refused to admit his crimes, and soon, the story took one final chilling turn. For years, Shipman rotted in Wakefield prison, locked away from the world he had once deceived. But in prison, he was powerless. No control, no patience to manipulate, no lives to take. And Harold Shipman hated that. On the morning of January 13th, 2004, just one day before his 58th birthday, Harold Shipman was found hanging in his cell. He had used his bed sheets to strangle himself, one final act of control over his own fate. Some saw it as justice denied, a coward's escape. Others saw it as a fitting end, a killer who had finally faced his own mortality. But one question remains. How many more did he kill? Officially, Shipman was convicted of 15 murders, but experts believe his true victim count could be as high as 250, making him one of the deadliest serial killers in history. For over 2 decades, Harold Shipman walked among us, a doctor, a murderer, a monster in disguise. He killed without fear. He believed he was smarter than the police, the public, even the families of his victims. But in the end, his own arrogance led to his downfall. And the town of Hyde will never forget the doctor who betrayed them all. If he had never forged the will, would he have lived on to massacre his own community? Let us know what you think about this case below in the comments.